So, after being transported in a younger cloned body, now bear that in mind, the word cloned, because they do have the technology to do this. This is not the only person to actually say that they can clone. In fact, one of the areas in Area 51, one of the basement sort of, you've got different levels, which I haven't covered yet, but because as soon as I start getting into what actually they do in Area 51, these videos are probably going to get pulled off. But one of those areas does deal with clones. He came back 15 minutes apparently after the time that he had left. So time travelled back 17 years, all but 15 minutes. And there was a timeline where people had, he was missing, and obviously his family and everything else. But of course, once he goes back in time, they suppressed his memories, but he obviously can recall them, or possibly went to a hypnotist to recall them. The Philadelphia experiment with time travel. Now, of course, it's anyone that's in that industry or the elites will claim it's a hoax, and they basically said it was a made-up story. But you can tell that to the people who died. Yes, people actually died on the ship, and you can tell that to their family members who no longer see them. You can also tell that to, wait for it, Einstein and Tesla were actually involved in this experiment. Now they didn't stay for very long. They did come along to the actual place where it was moored, and helped out with some of the electronic type things. So I'll cover what actually happened in the next video, but it's a fascinating story. And if you are interested in this story, look for a guy called Al Bielek. He talks about whether or not you believe him. He talks about being one of the people on. So the Philadelphia experiment was originally designed to phase the ship. Do you remember I was talking about interdimensional? To phase the ship so that the enemy wouldn't be able to see it. Unfortunately, the day that actually they did the first experiment, what happened was a lot of the sailors ended up being fused inside the actual hull of the ship. Some of them sort of halfway through the floor, like this guy here, his legs were dangling. Obviously they died. So it's quite horrific. Now I'm just going from memory. Now I think the actual ship travelled to another place in Florida actually for a couple of minutes and then came back, and that's where Al Bielek's story comes into it. Now I think there was a bit of time travel as well. I think that it arrived a couple of minutes earlier in Florida than when it left. So I'll tell you the next bit. So Al Bielek's story while he was on the Philadelphia ship, or the Philadelphia experiment, the Eldridge, while they was going through a mist, fog, whatever you want to call it, opened up underneath the ship while people were being phased through. Now he jumped off, apparently, I think from memory, sorry, it's been a long time since I've researched this one, him and his brother jumped off the ship and into this sort of weird stuff that's underneath the ship. He ended up time traveling to the future, where he eventually had to find the military to be able to send him back. Now it's been a long time since I've heard his story. But he managed to get back to the time that he left, and then obviously as time went on, back to now, he then started to tell his story. So it's definitely worth looking up his. I think he's passed now, but he's done. There was radio interviews and all sorts of things. Very compelling. Woo! 300. We made it 300 videos. Thank you, everybody. I know I keep saying thank you, but without you, I would just be talking to myself. But let's go back to time travel. So let's start on the basics on how time travel is possible. So I'm trying to do this as basic as I can. So Einstein had come up with the equation that E equals mc squared, which you may have heard of, which basically means E equals the energy, mass, and c the speed of light. So that determines the mass of where you are. So in other words, the gravitation so for example, if you're on Earth, you will have a certain mass, but if you was on another planet that's like 10 times the size, then that would have a different mass. Whereas if you're in space, it wouldn't have mass. Then you've got the energy that's inputted into it, and then the speed of light. So the best way to describe all of this for you is the ISS, which is the International Space Station, and Earth has an atomic clock. These are absolutely synchronized right down to milliseconds. So these don't go out. These will always be aligned with each other. However, astronauts on their longest trip round, I can't remember the name of the guy, but one of the astronauts that stayed on there with the atomic clock noticed that he had his atomic clock was 0.0000 something slower than what the Earth's atomic clock should be. So in other words, because he's further away from Earth, he lived literally a slower life, even though it was only tiny fraction. But the further away he got or would get from Earth, the longer he would live. So this adds 100% credence to the Anunnaki coming here with their different planet size and the fact that they're away from the sun a lot longer than we are, and the speed that they go round adds that they could literally have lived on Earth for thousands and thousands of years, relative, that's the word, relative to what we would be on Earth. So time is relative. Now Stephen Hawking's done a book called A Brief History of Time, which I've read. There was a few errors that I noticed in there. You're probably going to say, how can I be smarter than Stephen Hawking's? Well, his are theories, and it's not my fault I've come up and found some discrepancies in his theories. But if you want to give that a good read, you can, but it doesn't still say how to actually create time travel. So let's move on to CERN, which is that Large Hadron Collider that we all know about, which I've mentioned earlier. Now these guys apparently are trying to create time travel. Now whistleblowers have said they've actually done it and even had dinosaurs come through.